My name is John Simba, and I'm a lawyer by profession, practicing law as a senior partner at Simba Simba Advocates. And before that, I've been involved in other institutions, but the one that will be of greater interest for the conversation we have before us is that I worked for Industrial and Commercial Development Corporation for about 13 years, ICDC. And it is during the time that I worked for the giant corporation that I then got involved as a lawyer for ICDC, and as part of project teams that were involved in setting up projects, that I got involved with Coca-Cola and the bottling plants that now constitute Almasi Beverages. We set up Mount Kenya Bottlers up in Nyeri, and I was on the board representing ICDC. And at one time later, I briefly chaired the board of Mount Kenya Bottlers. And also ICDC put up Rift Valley Bottlers, and I sat on that board for a couple of years. And later, the last one that was put up by ICDC was Kisii Bottlers, and I was chairman for many years actually. And in all these three bottling plants, ICDC Investments, which we now know as Centum, was deeply involved in providing project finances, and as a shareholder as well. And therein then began my relationship with these three bottling plants, which later collapsed into one institution we now call Almasi Beverages Limited. And in all the three, Centum was and has always been a very critical owner of these companies. Now, as I have stated, we had three different bottling plants, each one of them basically producing exactly the same things. Coca-Cola, that is Coca-Cola products. Coca-Cola as a drink, Fanta, Sprite, Stoney, soda water, and later we added Dasani, the drinking water. But for all intents and purposes, these institutions were different, with different governance structures, different boards. And although there was commonality as far as shareholding, obviously, the Centum, ICDC, the corporation, and then other individual Kenyans as shareholders, their culture, their corporate culture was very different. And later, as we continued to carry on and grow these businesses, together with the help of the Coca-Cola company, the representative officers here in Kenya, and as the owner of the brands, we realized that greater value would be created for its shareholders if these three plants came together and formed one production unit, or at least was governed centrally, and that it developed strategic directions as one, not as three bottling plants. Now, it was around this time, because Centum was deeply involved in this, that in the board we had these discussions. How do we go about merging the three plants and convincing all the different shareholders to come together and form one institution? And although Centum and ICDC were the two really major shareholders, it was important that everyone else who owned shares in these three plants bought into the vision, bought into the concept, and realized that greater benefits would be derived by creating one institution. And because Centum was so much involved in many other investments, and they understood the value of creating synergies and of addressing costs in an organization, that we crafted policies and programs to convince the smaller shareholders to buy into the concept of merging the three plants. And as a result of this, suggestions were made, and Centum played a very critical role here in helping develop an information memorandum that contained not only the regulatory requirements and approvals that would be required, but also pointed out what benefits would accrue to the shareholders as a result of creating one unit. And because Centum believed, because it was dealing with so many other shareholders as an investment company, that showing that wealth could be created by merging these institutions, and that information and communicating with other shareholders was so critical, that it brought certainly unique, through its representatives on the board, some unique perspectives in ensuring that we created and developed this information memorandum that then enabled all the owners of these three plants make informed decisions, informed, I might add, informed investment decisions, because now they had information before them. What the history of the companies were, where we were as far as the ownership and assets of the businesses were concerned, and what the future held as far as the merged entity would be. And it's out of that, and the meeting at different times, all the stakeholders, obviously starting with the shareholders themselves, talking to staff, that as we walk towards merging the organizations, no jobs will be created, will be lost, rather that everybody will have opportunities in a much larger institution, and that their career paths would then develop in tandem with the growth of the businesses. And because industry and the creation of jobs, and because of the locational, the geographical locations of these enterprises, it was also important to convince the local leaders and the government itself that this was a good thing, even for creation of jobs. Because if you had a bigger unit, you will take advantage of economies of scale and scope, and you'll be able to grow, create more jobs directly at the factories and also indirectly through the entire value chain. And you'll have probably bigger distributors and more better financed distributors, because the margins then will improve and that the business will grow. And obviously, the biggest stakeholder is always the government. And the government is always interested in three things, and we are able to assure government authorities that those three things will be met. That firstly, the income stream through taxes, whether corporate or personal, would not only be maintained, but it would actually grow because of the growth of the businesses, and also because of increased employment, and directly and indirectly. And secondly, that jobs will not be lost. And in fact, people will have greater opportunities to grow their talents and their skills than in three small units. And obviously, lastly, that as the businesses grew, we will have technology in production and distribution, and the logistics of supply and the logistics of distribution, and technologies, new technologies in production will be available to Kenya. And as a result of that, then we were able to convince the government, and we were able also to then get the approvals that were required. And in all this, I recall, because I've been on the board of, as I said, of, at different times of those three plants, and now I'm on the board of Almasi, and I'm still on the board of Almasi. We were able then to convince the government that it will be in the interest of this economy for this merger to take place. And staying with the governance issue, because now we had a bigger organization, and because Centum had been involved obviously in handling larger investments, and its portfolio was more broad and diversified, that we created structures that enabled us to deliver on the promises that we made to various stakeholders. And we were able to borrow from the example of Centum. And by the way, for a long time, I also sat on the board of Centum. So these are some of the things that I know, having been on that board for many years, that we borrowed certain practices, that it was important to create important committees that will take time to look at each facet of the business and come up with options on how to handle some of those. For instance, like in most big organizations like this, we had audit and risk, and I know that Centum, as a quoted investment, this is one of the requirements, and we were able to tap in on their experience on how you structure audit and risk, what will be the mandate of the audit committee, and what will be the deliverables of this committee. The other that was created was strategy and finance. And obviously, in every business, you must be able to look into the future, because it's not, business like this is not a morning business. It's not a flower that blossoms in the morning and withers in the evening. We're here for the long range. And the brands under Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola has been around for more than 100 years. And so you are looking at creating also a business here that will probably be more than 100 years. And so creating a committee on strategy and finance not only borrows leaves from past experience, to understand why, for instance, we did things as well as we did, or we were not able to meet our budgets, but also to learn from these lessons, to create a present as a platform in order to project the future. And the strategy committee was one of those. And this we borrowed from the examples of Centum itself, because it's been involved in these things. And the other committee, because it's good to create structures, because unless the governance and the observance of the critical governance principles are observed, then really you are getting nowhere. You are really pretending to fly, but not making progress. And so a governance and nominations committee was created to ensure that we keep to the narrow and the straight of governance principles. And also, if we nominated people, looked for, directors from outside, this committee would first understand the mix of skills and experience within the committee of, within the board of Almasi, and then identify the gaps within the membership of the board, and then look for that specific skill that you needed to strengthen the board to look in the future. And this is a committee that I chaired for the duration that Centum was involved in Almasi. So as far as coming together as one, creating structures to enable solidify our foundations and build on them, we borrowed a lot from the experience of Centum itself and the people that it sent to the board. I remember that James Moria, the CEO, the group CEO of Centum, was also our chairman, an individual with a considerable experience. And he brought this experience not only as a lawyer, but also as a financial analyst, to help us understand a lot of the dynamics of this merged organization. And obviously, on governance again, one of the most important aspects of governance. And remember, we had given certain promises to our shareholders, small and big. And we ensured that we held within the time frames that were allowed by the law our annual general meetings, and that shareholders were supplied with information about the company, its performance, not just the financials, but rather everything that we believed was critical for them to know, and to have their confidence that what the board and management were doing were in their not only short-term but long-term interests. And we always had very robust annual general meetings where shareholders, and mainly a lot of the smaller shareholders, were encouraged to exercise their right to fully participate in annual general meetings, to ask questions, because we also believed that just in the same way Centum would address issues with its own shareholders, that if the board and management were not able to respond adequately to the questions and concerns of shareholders, then they have no business being in the board or in management. And we learned a lot of this from the experiences of Centum itself. I think other than governance issues, because governance are so important, and you remember that a lot of companies would fall or remain in the arena of competition depending on the strength of their governance principles and adherence to those principles. But equally important is resources. I mentioned that James Moria himself, as our chairman and the group CEO of Centum, is an experienced corporate operative. And in addition to that, I think Centum itself realized that because now the stake they had in the merged company was larger, because what happened was that as we were convincing the minority shareholders to come along with us, obviously there were those who felt that the future was a little uncertain and that they needed to cash in on their investment at the merger point, because in any event, the price at which the shares were exchanging hands were well above their initial investments. So some of those shareholders disposed of their shares, and because Centum wanted to increase its shareholding in the merged entity, offered an opportunity for those who wanted to dispose of their shares to actually do so to Centum. And over time, Centum had built the ownership in the merged entity to above the 50% mark. And eventually, when the Centum exited last year, it was holding slightly above 53%. And one can look at this in several ways. One, obviously, in investments, if you continue in an entity, then it depends on whether you are convinced on the strategy of that entity and the returns that you expect going forward, or if you are, then you retain, you remain in. But what is important here is the fact that nobody who wanted to exit, although all the shareholders were encouraged to remain, but anyone who wanted to exit, there was already a market for their shares. And these were provided by Centum, and Centum did not seek to drive down prices just because people felt they didn't want to be part of the merged entity. And there, I think, tells you something about the integrity and the concern that Centum itself had, just like all of us who are also minority shareholders had in the organization, and those who needed to exit. So there were no issues about those who wanted to exit. But because also Centum realized that, okay, now they were the major shareholder, basically controlling Almasi. Controlling an enterprise can be either through shareholding, that you have more than 50%, so that the ordinary resolutions, you can actually pass with two other shareholders. You don't have everybody to come along with you. But because it believed in what I call corporate democracy, that everybody was given an opportunity. But because also we had made promises about the growth of the merged entity, that it was important also to identify areas at operations level, at management level, that were critical to realize and keep our promises to the shareholders. One of these was in finance. When you're dealing with a big organization with debt financing and equity as well, that you need to ensure that your finances are in order, and that everything that revenues that you are generated are also put into productive avenues to create, to generate more revenues. And I mean things, treasury management and all that sort of stuff. How you invest, whether in fixed deposits in the banks, whether government paper, that sort of thing. And you need someone who understands all this, who understands your cash needs, immediate and medium term, and your long-term needs, so that you are able to invest funds in a manner that enables your day-to-day operations not to be stuffed of cash, but at the same time taking advantage of whatever opportunities were available to maximize on the cash earning money, earning more money, that is. And that's how then Centum was able to second to Almasi, one of its resource persons in finance, Kimeu, Wambua Kimeu, who was the chief finance officer of Almasi for all the entire period that Centum was involved in Almasi, and Wambua did some great work. I remember back in 2016, 2017, we were joking and saying, hey, whatever you do, we must make at least 1 billion shilling of profits. And we used to refer to his Wambua as 1 billion. And sure enough, in 2017, I think the combined entity now made profits of more than 1 billion shillings. We'd never been able to reach that level. And as a result, because there were also promises to staff that if you reached certain thresholds, you made the budget and went beyond it, that you would also obviously have decent bonuses out of it. And I don't think that the staff at those 3 plants had ever received a bigger bonus than they did back in 2017. And this obviously would not have been possible, not only because Wambua was the finance guy, but also the teams we have, right from the group managing chief executive officer, Joyce Macharia, and the other teams downstream, the sales people, the marketing people, and that sort of thing. But because Centum was part of all these things, they had more members in the board than everyone else, that we were able to really to achieve this. Ours was not a dysfunctional board. It was a board that critically looked at all the facets of the business. And we debated issues freely and criticisms, and at the end, once we agreed this is the direction, then the resources were available to ensure that we achieved our goals. And Centum played a big role in this, because at the end of the day, as a publicly listed company, if anything happened, probably they would have lost a lot more as a major shareholder or the majority shareholder in Almasi. And so I remember this because I also know the challenges that we faced, challenges of putting resources together. Because, you know, at the end of the day, it's not everyone who can run an institution. You need some very special people to do that. And I think we were able, with the help of Centum, to realize this specific goal on procuring resources that we needed. A strategic direction. Now, because the carbonated soft drinks industry is a very competitive business in our environment. Obviously, the brands we produce under the Coca-Cola banner are household names. Coca-Cola itself, now as a drink, Fanta, Sprite, and all those mixtures that we have. But at the same time, you need to strategically position yourself in the market and see which way the market is headed. And this brings me to the issue of, say, containers. You know, you have basically two containers in as far as these products are concerned. One is the glass, like this. I keep this to remind me of my that I must always have a Coca-Cola or a Coca-Cola product, because we've been with it the last 40 years. But also you have what we call PET. That is the non-returnables. This we call returnable containers, glass. And non-returnables are plastic or PET. And we realized that a lot of people don't want to put deposit down for the bottles. Secondly, that you have what you call drinking on the go. Take for instance, someone traveling in a matatu to an upcountry destination or some destination, and or buses. You stop at some bus station or matatu station, and who comes along? Those very enterprising Kenyans who know travelers are thirsty or they need something to sort of improve their energies as they travel. And so they're bringing you, whether it is scones, whether it is water, whether it is samosas, whatever it is. But when it comes to drinks, a traveler will not give you a deposit for the bottle, a glass bottle, because it doesn't know, firstly, the inconvenience of having put down the expended, probably, the cash he needed for whatever else, wherever he's headed. But also, the inconvenience of carrying a bottle with him as part of his luggage, which was never his intention when he started the journey. And so the question was, how do you move to satisfy this consumer who is traveling, or someone who is at a function? Whether it's a political function, whether it's a church function, or a gathering of any sort, that as you drink, you are not being asked to put down a deposit for glass, because what your interest is just one, the contents of the glass. Either you down it right there and then return the bottle, or you take it away with you. If you down it, it takes away the pleasure of you taking time to have your drink. It's not like this glass of water that you down once and quenches your thirst. And so we are looking at how do we strategically position Almasi in the market so that you're meeting the requirements as far as container is concerned of all the consumers, satisfy the consumers. And remember, our motto as producers of Coca-Cola products, we're refreshing our customers anywhere, at any time, 24/7, in any location. And so when our committee on strategy sat to, and this was chaired by a representative of ICDC, how do we deal with this? What is happening in other parts of the world? Again, here we were able to borrow from the immense experience of Centum, that containers globally, the consumer was migrating more towards PET, or what we call plastics. But let's call it PET because plastic is a little different. We call it PET. We're migrating to this, or non-returnable containers. But then non-returnable containers needed immense investment to make, because you do not buy, when you are producing as much as we are doing, you do not buy non-returnable containers and then take them to the factory, because then you have issues of hygiene, issues of the wholesome of the product. What it meant is that you must actually produce the container at the factory and then fill it. And you can imagine your business is not producing. That's why we've never been in glass production. That's why Central Glass, which was owned by breweries, that's where we bought a lot of returnable glass from, or mill glass in Mombasa. But PET is different. You have to produce it at the factory, and as you produce the bottle, you also put it in the production process, in the filling process, and that, you can imagine, needs a lot of investments. And so all of us who sat in the board and were part of the strategic committee were thinking about then how do we raise resources. Firstly, you have to make the decision that you actually need to migrate to this, and then work out the pros and cons of returnables against non-returnables. Is this long term? Will in 2 years, 3 years, consumers change and say, hey, we are no longer interested in non-returnable containers, we will go back to the old bottle? And you can imagine that a consumer shift has resulted in companies going out of business, or others actually remaining in business. And so you have to do a lot of analysis and borrow from what other markets have done. What have consumers in developed markets, what has happened there? In other developing markets, how have the consumers behaved? Those who migrated into non-returnables, what has been their experience? If you want to hedge your investments so that you are not wholly in non-returnables and not wholly on returnables, what percentages are we talking about here? Because imagine when you invest in bottles, I can tell you, as somebody who has been involved in Coca-Cola business in this country for more than 40 years, it's massive investments. And so is non-returnables. And so, again, working on strategies, on experiences of others, we were able to borrow considerably, again, from the experience of Centum and its officers, and obviously with the others, experiences of ICDC, for instance, what has been their experiences dealing with others, and how have markets either remained static or moved between returnables and non-returnables. And in this, we were able then to make decisions. And that's why today, if you go to Nyeri, where the Almasi has its main production unit, that we were able to make the massive investments that were required for us to migrate, not wholly, but substantially into non-returnables. And I think Centum played a key role in giving us data, ideas, and for us to do this. Just in the same way, because as I said, we have never been, and we had never been a dysfunctional board or a dysfunctional strategic and finance committee, for instance. And so the contributions from Centum, contributions from ICDC, for instance, and all of us who sat on the board, then we were able to make the critical decisions that so that these investments are making returns and working for its owners, the shareholders. Obviously, I talked a lot about making those strategic decisions, returnables and non-returnables, massive investments involved. And obviously, when you want to expand and you need capital, there are several ways of doing it, but two most critical ones. You can finance your operations wholly through debt, that is borrowing, or through equity, going to your shareholders for more money. Or you can do a hybrid of both. However you define a debt, whether it's long-term loans, and then you have overdrafts, obviously, short-term, and then you go to your shareholders. And in this, when we went to our shareholders for a rights issue, you know, a rights issue is when you ask your shareholders to put in funds proportionate to the shareholding. And it is not compulsory that any shareholder increases their shareholding. And so there were those who, again, either for lack of funds or that they had other uses for the funds that they had, we were not able to totally raise us through a rights issue all the funds we needed. But I believe Centum saw a lot more ahead and was able to borrow substantial sums of money. I believe it was around $16 million of additional equity into the company. You know, when you talk about the two modes of financing a project, equity and debt, okay? Equity is risky capital. If a company goes under, that is it, you've lost your shot. Examples that we can give. No, let me not give any examples at this time, but you can remember major companies even in the recent past, whether in distribution, in manufacturing, that have gone under. Now, the difference is that the one who holds shares, equity in a company, you lose it, yeah? And the debt, because if it's a bank, it will take security. And so a bank will always recover, in some cases, the whole of whatever balance that is remaining out of the loans that it gave, or the overdraft that it gave, or substantially, if not the whole, substantially, the whole of the amount that it lent. But a shareholder loses a lot. And for you to make huge investments of risk capital in a business, it means you have confidence in that business. You have confidence in its returns. You have confidence in its growth. And Centum was able to provide the funds that we actually needed, which meant that they had confidence in the business. And I think this confidence was demonstrated by the fact that when they exited, I think the Centum made a tight capital gain out of their investment. So it was a wise move for them to do. But for everybody else who is involved, funds were available for the investment that we required. And so in a way, everyone then benefits out of that investment, and they will continue to invest to benefit into the future. And that is important, that when you are in an investment, that you have a key shareholder who will be able to provide either directly or negotiate capital that you need for growth. And I think all of us who've been shareholders at Almasi, I think we are grateful largely because Centum came through as far as the rights issue and providing additional funds were concerned. That's capital raising, and then the risking. This is an interesting one. You know, every business has risks. That's why these days it was not there. If we talk maybe 15, 20 years ago, you didn't talk about audit and risk. And most companies did not take risk extremely seriously. Yeah? But now, after so many things have happened to major corporations around the globe, risk is a major topic that every board, every management discusses and provides against. And obviously, just to mention 2 or 3 of these, you look at, say, competition. Competition is always a risk, but businesses thrive on competition. So that should not be seen as a major issue that, hey, there's so much competition in the market, what shall we do? That's why a lot of young guys like yourselves who are good and who have been trained in different skills will actually thrive in the arena of competition. And so competition is a risk. Then it's upon you to look at whether your product is not is addressing the proper market segment, or the quality, or delivery times, and all that sort of stuff that you can deal with. But there are others that you need also people who understand some of this, and leveraging on connections and their knowledge and experience to be able to deal with. For instance, dealing with relationships with government. There's nothing wrong, for instance, to lobby government not to levy taxes or to reduce taxes. Like, you know, when this invisible enemy that we talk about, the virus that enables us not to recognize each other now, when it came along, because it was so devastating, the government reduced taxes. And how did the government reduce taxes? Because there was so much presentations to the government that business were suffering, and that government will contribute to return to normality and to enable companies to remain afloat if it addressed tax issues. So really, there is nothing wrong in lobbying government if the government is convinced that by giving you that rebate, you will actually have greater turnover, and so what it has lost through a rebate will actually make up because you have now become more efficient, and your reach is more, and the cake you have baked is larger. And so both in this, both Centum, and because ICDC is a government operation, Centum has helped us leverage its connections with government, and because it's government itself is a major investor, by the way, in Centum. I think it is the second biggest investor in Centum. And so, to reduce that risk of taxation, and to address this when we were challenged with tax issues, there was always Centum as a major shareholder, the majority shareholder in Almasi, came through for the organization in this, so that in that sense it was able to mitigate certain risks, whether they were taxation or other issues on labor or labor related issues, that the risks that would have come through and devastatingly so for the business were largely addressed. And I believe that Centum played a role in this. The other one, and that was so important that everyone else was really involved in, and I started with this when we made a decision that it would be in the interests of not only the shareholders of the different 3 units, but the country, for us to merge. And to be enabled to do this, you need to have effective stakeholder management, and you know, just to define who are stakeholders in this, so that we are all on the same page. You're talking about shareholders, obviously. You are talking about suppliers. You are talking about staff. You are talking about the government itself, whether as a custodian of all our welfare, but also as a major shareholder in every business because of the taxes. Just take it that, you know, in every business, if you make corporate profits, 25% of that, courtesy of the rebates that our government gave to businesses, 25% of that belongs to government. And I'm sure after this virus is gone, it will go back to 30%. 30% is a huge sum of money in any business. That is the single biggest cut from the cake, and that is corporate taxes. But when you put in pay as you earn for the employees, when you put in customs and excise duties, when you put in VAT, which is a consumer taxes, if you put all those taxes and the various levies, whether it is these days there is a railway levy, you contribute to NSSF, and NSSF helps the government in this long-term planning and financing of infrastructure projects, and whether it is to the training levy, all this, if you put all this together, then you begin to understand how important the government is as a stakeholder in your business. But at the same time, and this is where sometimes we never look at things that way, that even if the government is the largest stakeholder in our various businesses, the government has not appointed, unless when KRA appoints people on bonded warehouses to have part of the key that you open in order to take out your spare parts, you get out your supplies as you pay the taxes. Other than that, just imagine this, other than that, you start with the fact that the government is the biggest stakeholder in every business. Other than that, when you imagine that, yet the government has never said, now, Mr. Simba, we hear you're going to be the managing director of this company. We must vet you first, because we are a big stakeholder, and we must know that you're going to look after these assets properly so that we get our piece. The government takes on faith that every business will be run efficiently for the benefit of its shareholders, but also for the benefit of the government. And that's why you have all these rules and regulations. And the government, as a stakeholder, enforces its rights through those rules and regulations. That first, you must pay people properly. You cannot have to as I learned many, many years ago that there are employers who have two, how do you call it, salary rolls, payrolls. One that is they show government people that we are paying properly, and the actual one. And but so the government says if you do that and we catch you, you are in hot soup and you'll be fined and fined heavily. Yes, the taxman does not have someone sitting in your offices to ensure that your books are properly written, that VAT returns are properly done, and all this. But it has rules that enables them to follow and come and look at your books. And so managing stakeholder relations, starting with the government itself, it's so critical. And that is why even today a number of institutions have what they call corporate and government relations officer to manage that relationship. And then obviously the next biggest one is also the stakeholders, the shareholders, the employees. If you belong to a union, then you have the union interceding on your behalf with management, so that, and with management and the board, so that their rights are also taken care of. And then the second one that also gives you things on the faith that you run your business properly are suppliers. You've heard from I think retail chains, how suppliers now feel that they have been taken to the cleaners because they give you goods in good faith that you will sell the goods and pay them. But they don't put a clerical officer in your business to ensure that when their things are sold, you actually get the funds. But for businesses to thrive and grow, you need to manage all these different stakeholders. Pay your suppliers in time so that they continue to supply. Pay government, the old saying, pay unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Yeah, you know that comes from the good book so many years ago. But it is deep. It is deep that the government provides you with a lot of things. Every time you have a patrol of askari to ensure that your property is fine. They don't ask, hey, today 2 policemen passed near your factory, so please you owe the government 1,000 bob. No. It is out of these taxes we pay that government is able to provide these services. But sometimes we never stop to think about this. And this is where, because both Centum and ICDC have been involved in all these businesses, that they brought certain unique perspectives in these stakeholder relations that then have enabled us as Almasi to thrive, to grow, create more jobs for Kenyans, pay even higher taxes to the government, and generally introduce the technology. Like that technology of PT is very, very special technology that you have. And then you have to ensure that the product is wholesome. Then you have technology that ensures the only time that you have human intervention in the bottle is when they are being offloaded from a truck, and when you are actually opening the bottle. Because then everything in between, it is automation. Sometimes people look at that in the early years, back in the 80s, in the late 80s, when we were looking at this automation. And I remember that time going to a big plant in Germany and wondering where were the people, because it's huge. I didn't see the people, and it's all automation. And sometimes we talk about, if you automate, people will lose their jobs. But the flip side is that once you automate, you bring down costs. You may not have a worker For instance, when this bottle, to ensure there is no impurities inside, in the past, there used to be someone with on a glass which is lit, okay? As the bottle is passing before this glass and it is lit completely, you can look at the bottle and see whether there is an impurity inside or not. But we are human beings, eyes get tired, and so, and the bottle at which, the speed at which it passes, imagine the filler is going round and filling about 40,000 bottles in 1 hour. So you can imagine the speed. If it's leaving the filler and going to the conveyor belt, and your light is here, these things are coming at great speed. Your eyes will get tired. And so what happened? Technology. You have about 4 cameras, one from bottom here, so that you look at whether there is a sediment at the bottom, 1, 2 each from the side, and 1 from the top. And someone can say, hey, a job has been lost. But by ensuring that you are even, instead of 40, you are producing 40,000 bottles in an hour. You are creating efficiencies. You might not create a bottle, a job at someone looking at it to see whether there is an impurity in here, but because you are now able to produce more at lower costs, that you are putting a product in the market faster, and that you may lose this one job, but in the distribution system, you might probably create 3 or 4. And so we've been able to bring this technology. And you remember those 3 things I talked about: government, maintaining employment, ensuring that government revenues are not compromised, and technology. Because technology is what will enable businesses to remain competitive and to remain relevant in the marketplace. And all these things would not have been possible if organizations with vast experience and very knowledgeable people like Centum were not part of Almasi.